welcome everyone to Rupert. I hope some of you have had a chance to have a look at the exhibition, which is currently on until the 3rd of August. On the 2nd of August we have a closing performance by Julie Bernard, who's a French artist who's also in the show. She did a silk cloak which hangs on the side of the architecture now. And that should be a really great performance where she'll be doing a performative reading of some text that she wrote at Rupert when she was a resident here 3 years ago. 3 years ago, I think, yeah. A little housekeeping thing. As I understand it, there will be taxis available to take you back into town, so you just ask my lovely colleague Katrina, and we can organise that to happen. But there'll be some chance to speak to Rick afterwards. A little context of why we have Rick here. So the show that we have on at the moment is an exploration of materials and materiality, and looks at this new development of ideas, which is sort of largely conceived under this topic of new materialism, which Rick is crucial in developing that conversation. When you look at the exhibition, which is called Entangled Tales, a phrase which comes from Karen Berard, someone who Rick interviewed for a book which I very much recommend, which he wrote with Iris van der Toorten, very difficult Dutch name, called New Materialism, Interviews and Cartographies, which is a brilliant collection of essays and interviews with a great introduction. So a little brief intro about Rick. Dr. Rick Dolphijn, he has a background in philosophy and art theory, and he's interested in the theoretical humanities at large, media and performance theory in particular. And he's written 2 books, one being Foodscapes, which developed from his doctoral thesis, which I really recommend reading if you're interested in food or if you eat food, which I'm guessing is probably most of you. And the book explores what happens between the eaten and the eating, and just the format of the book is quite interesting because it takes a slightly unusual academic way of writing a book. He also wrote Towards the Deleuzean Epics of Consumption in 2004, and Rick is a great scholar on Deleuze, and so if you're interested in Deleuze, which I'm guessing most art students are, he's a great person to chat about that. And then with Iris, which I'm not going to try and pronounce this anyway again, New Materialism, Interviews and Cartographies, where you can find interviews with Rosa Guidotti, who works with Rick at Utrecht University, Manuel de Landa,
Karen
Berard and
Quentin Yashu.
Yes, there we go. And he's just finishing a new monography which will bring together his research interests, and as I understand is also looking at the concept of fascism today, and is working with several different scholars from around the world exploring this theme. He's written on new materialism, which is something that we were looking at in this exhibition, ecology and ecosophy. Is that how you pronounce it? Which is you can find his short essays in the post-humanist glossary, which is a great resource, and is also interested in the developments in continental philosophy and speculative thoughts. I think you'll all find his works really interesting if you like the arts, which I'm guessing you do, because you're here, and he once wrote that the future of the humanities, the future of the world even, necessarily has to be developed in the closest possible connection with the arts, and we'll hear why that is. I'm guessing you read the brief description about what this talk will engage with, so I'll hand over to Rick to start the conversation, and then there'll be a chance to ask questions at the end. Thank you very much for coming. And thank you, Rick.
Thank you for this generous introduction. I asked for a microphone because I don't have a very strong voice, and especially if I talk for a while, and it gets worse and worse. So this is better, thank you. Great to be here, and it's an amazing building, amazing setting, and very interesting exhibition. I don't know what your background is, of course, all the people sitting here. I guess most of you are somehow linked with the arts. I'm working in arts and in philosophy, doing my PhD in philosophy. And I guess it would make sense if I start by talking a bit about what materialism is all about. I do want to do a bit of reading because some parts of my talk I need to be very strict. In the end, I'm a philosopher, which means that I want to conceptualize things and I want to conceptualize something as the object. So then I have to do some reading. But I would like to start by saying a bit about new materialism because I think that is interesting and I think it's important for understanding what the exhibition is about, but also for understanding why so many people are working with this idea of new materialism these days. And this happens in academia and in the arts. So why are we all of a sudden in such a wonderful new conversation? I think that's important. So to start with, I think that the idea of new materialism, the term is quite difficult in the sense that you could question whether there's anything new about this, and you could also question whether it is materialist. So let's not get into that discussion. Why we wrote the book, we being Iris Dolphijn and myself, is that we saw that within academia and within the arts, so many people were saying that they were doing something with a new or a neo-materialism that we thought we need to map this. We need to interview the most important contributors and we need to write 4 essays on what, according to us, it is about. So that's what we did. And we start the book, and it's been, this one sentence I think is quoted about 1,000 times right now in different other volumes. We started by saying that this strand of new materialism that we want to investigate really came up in the middle of the 1990s when especially Rosie Braidotti and Manuel Landa were saying in different essays, and nothing to do with each other, they were saying we need a new kind of materialism. Question is, why did they say that, and why did all of the other scholars and artists think this was indeed something important? I guess it has to do with the 1990s. In the 1990s, people were very much focused, especially in academia, on literary theory, on linguistics, on the construction of science, and on interpreting science. That is what happened in cultural theory. That is what the whole cultural studies host was all about. Reading new forms of science, very much influenced by people like Ferdinand de Saussure and post-Lacanian theory. Reading science. And Rosie Braidotti and Manuel Landa, both very much inspired by Gilles Deleuze, by the way, said we should go in a different direction. It's not that we are not interested in science anymore, but we should go back to matter. How matter matters, in what way matter matters. For both of them, it was a very different enterprise. Rosie Braidotti came from feminism, so she would also always play with the idea of materiality, which is etymologically linked, of course, to the mater, to the mother. So giving birth to something, creating something is very close to that. And Emmanuel Landa was more interested in the sciences, so he looked at geology, and he looked at how materiality was being formed, and how, in a sense, sociology and geology and mathematics are not that different. They're all about ways in which things are being formed. So Manuel Landau was interested in that, and he said that we should skip the idea of language as a starting point. We should go back to the way materiality is being formed, and in that way we can also have discussions within the different parts of academia and within the arts. Manuel Landau started as a filmmaker, which is also very interesting actually. So they came to new materialism from very different directions and very different interests. But for some reason, many academics, also in response to the linguistic turn, said we are interested in looking at matter in a new way, in a different way. I think what was very important, and this happened more recent, but also for people like Karen Barrett and Kenton Nielsen, what was very important for them in the end was how this emphasis on matter allowed them to question dualisms. Dualisms have been very, very important in the recent history of philosophy, in the recent history of thought. The fathers of modernity, René Descartes and Immanuel Kant, live not too far from this place actually. René Descartes and Immanuel Kant were both very much working on oppositions, on creating or identifying oppositions and actually building their ideas of, for instance, the human being on these oppositions. So with both of them you see a sharp distinction between the subject and the object. The subject being the one in power, being the rational human being. The object being the world, kind of unpowerful thing. Yeah, what's the term for that? A kind of not slavish, kind of well, Descartes would immediately see this as a religious thing. He would say that God did not give the rest of the world the ability to think. So we would immediately say that the human being lives in the res cogitans, that was a term he used, so in the world of thought, and the rest of the world, including animals by the way, lived in the res extensa, which is the world of extension. So animals, according to Descartes, were just extensions. They did not have a mind, they could not think. The thinking happened by the human being, and the human being thought about the world. So that's how the dualism was not only created, but it was kind of operationalized. This is how the modern mind worked. There was a rational subject, and the rational subject had an idea about what the world was about. So this kind of dualism is not only working in terms of the distinction between subject and object, it also works with nature and culture. Nature is silent, nature doesn't do anything, it just sits there and waits. Before culture has, for some reason, the power to kind of domesticate, to turn into something. For Rose Bergotti, the difference between male and female was, of course, very important. Male being the dominant subjective force, and the female being the object of desire. Female being the silent one, being the one unable to respond in that sense. So for both of the Manuel Landau and Rose Bergotti, but in the end, for all these new materialists, it was important to question all forms of dualism. And as said, they were inspired by French theory, mainly Gilles Deleuze, but actually since the start of modernity there have been other forces, other thinkers who questioned the ideas of Descartes, the ideas of Kant, actually the whole idea of modernity. So this minor history of thought is always being reread in new materialism. So they will say, no, that if you want to understand something about the human being, don't go back to Descartes, go back to Spinoza. What does Benedict Spinoza say about the human being? It's a very different idea of the human being in Spinoza. In Spinoza, there's not a distinction between subject and object. In Spinoza, there is mind and matter, but it's not opposed to one another again, like with Descartes. Spinoza would say, and this is a very important line that I keep repeating also in the book, but in all the lectures, I guess. Spinoza would say, the mind is an idea of the body, while the body is the object of the mind. The mind is an idea of the body, while the body is the object of the mind. So what Spinoza stresses with this is that actually it's not so much about the mind and the body, it's about the way in which they engage in a relationship. So the mind is not a fixed thing, the body is not a fixed thing. For Spinoza, there's no reason to think of the body as the human body. It could be any kind of body. It could be any kind of conglomerate of things that function as a body. Together, in functioning as a body, this body comes up with an idea, and that is the mind for Spinoza. So the mind is also not linked to the human being. It is not something which is in any way human. Spinoza writes a famous letter to a guy named Schaller, and in that letter he says that the stone is not different from the infant in how it thinks. So there's no difference in how a stone thinks and in how an infant thinks. The stone desires, for instance, sunlight or water, the same way the infant desires the milk from the breast of the mother. Both of them think, both individualities, both entities, both bodies, think that they live independently from the world, but in the end they are subjected to all kinds of desires and all kinds of emotions in the stone, right? All entities, all individualities are in that sense relational. And that's what you can read in Spinoza, right? That the mind and the body are in the end consequences of a kind of a relationship. And it's only our limited point of view that turns these into subjects and objects and things and whatever you want to call it. But all of these processes create the mind and the body in that sense. So that is very important for new materialists. So the new materialists will not say there is only matter or mind is a consequence of matter. There's always the relationship through which all forms of materiality come to matter. So that's why new materialists always play with this idea of matter, which is not only the thing, but also what is important. So at the same time, it is a thing and an idea. And it's this at the same time which is crucial, because at the same time means that there is some kind of a relationship through which matter comes to matter, through which a thing and an idea create one another. And that is actually what also someone like Karen Barrett Rupert, who comes from quantum physics, who has written extensively on Niels Bohr. Don't read Niels Bohr, by the way. We thought, hey, it would be interesting to read Niels Bohr, but actually what Niels Bohr himself writes is not very interesting. In terms of quantum physics, it probably is, but as a humanities scholar, it's really very positive. It's kind of, we're going to restore the world and all that. But Karen Barrett's writings about Niels Bohr are very interesting because what she sees there is that in quantum physics, it's also not the body and the mind as a dualism which comes into being. Karen Barrett shows that in quantum theory, what matters is the relationship. Only the relationship is what matters. That's what you can read in any book on quantum mechanics. So what we call matter is the relationship. That's what they literally say. So that's why Karen Barrett comes up with a term like entanglement. Entanglement means that it is in the entanglement that both things and ideas come to be. Through the entanglement, things come into existence. Through the entanglement, an idea comes into existence. And we, as human beings, have been focused for a long time on the outcomes of these processes. But it's the processes themselves that actually matter. And we can read that too in the works of Gilles Deleuze. Gilles Deleuze talks of becoming, de venir. We should focus not so much on being, which for instance in the work of Martin Heidegger is so important. We should focus on becomings, in how the becoming, in how the processes create things. So now I want to turn to art and to talk about how art matters, or as I put it in the title of this talk, how art objects. As you can hear, I'm also playing with the term objects because when I say how art objects, I'm of course playing with the idea of the object and of objecting to something, resistance. So, as promised, I do want to do a bit of reading here, because I think it is very important that we, as new materialists, or trying to look at things from a new materialist perspective, have a very clear idea of what the object is. In theory, especially the past 10 years, under influence of feminism and post-colonial theory, the whole idea of the subject has been pretty much rethought or deconstructed, whatever term you want to use. But the idea of the object is still quite resistant for some reason. And I think that in rethinking what art can do, it's very important to question the idea of the object. Because it's so prominent in our thinking, to think about objects. And the second reason is that together with new materialism, there are many other new developments in theory, and one of them is object-oriented ontology. And although I like colleagues in general, we're all trying to make sense of the things that happen around us. But I'm very skeptic about object-oriented ontology. And the reason is that I think that they, scholars that work on object-oriented ontology, really misunderstand the idea of the object. There's a very romantic idea of the object in object-oriented ontology, which you could also read in the earlier writings in phenomenology, for instance. Let's return to the objects again. The world is so complex. Let's return to the objects, which is quite ridiculous. So I think that it's important to understand what we mean with the object and how the object and the thing are questioned by new materialism, actually. And it happens especially in art, this kind of questioning. So, as I said, I won't read it. The earlier part of this talk I will call the Introduction to New Materialism, and now I want to talk about the artwork or the horror of the object. What we call the artwork and what is considered to be the object that is its locus are not the same thing. Or to phrase it differently, an artwork is not a thing. One could perhaps say that there is a particular kind of thingliness about the artwork, again referring to Heidegger, mass or energy is mobilized. But that would be the same as to say that the artwork matters, and that its idea is necessarily an idea of the body. And that is true. This is what I just said about Spinoza. The artwork by all means concerns the material, or rather, it is a flow in the material. Perhaps, to be very precise, it is the rupture in this flow, as it masks it. The artwork is material, and at the same time, it has to concern an idea. Its material reality and its idea are by all means the same thing. This is what Spinoza always says. The mind and the body are separate, but they are the same thing, which means that they are a consequence of the same relationship. The idea that an artwork is actually a thing is a mistake, and it is a historical mistake. Yet the fact that the artwork is not a thing or an object does not mean that the artwork cannot be turned into a thing or an object. It is its most horrible destiny, but yes, of course, an artwork can be captured. It can be placed under a bell jar. And then, if you exhibit it in Paris or in Bangkok, it would still sit under the same glass bell jar, stewing in its own sour air, to paraphrase Sylvia Plath. It would turn into the same thing. There's Van Gogh's sunflowers again, there's Picasso's face again. The horror to have been autographed by Michelangelo or Picasso. All the amazing art that is suffocating in front of our eyes, it is an absolute tragedy. It is all very similar to what happened to the ideas of Descartes. His cogito ergo sum is by all means suffocating, subjected to so many interpretations that cling onto it. The history of critique is in that sense very close to the history of art, or rather the history of modern art, as that was the art that came first, thus starting position from which it unfolds a complete history of art throughout space-time. The horror of the object. This is why the history of art, or the hysteria of art, is by definition a tragic enterprise. And it is also why, the moment those in power understood the power of art, it has been placed under this bell jar continuously. All the archives, all the museums, gladly work with the same historical error, that art is about objects. Obviously, this is done for political reasons. It is done on purpose. To objectify is to solidify society, to groove society, to territorialize a people through its archive and through its objects. This is your history, and the other one is hers. The passions are there to stop the time, to lure us into a society of God, where the one ruler is still in charge, praised by all of us. Yes, the Christ on the cross is a good example of this, as is that famous statue of the man on the horse, whatever its name, whatever its place. Obviously, objects like statues, or paintings, or church interiors, or words when it comes to a poem, for instance. They can feel and they can suffocate the artwork, similar to how an audience is suffocated in and through the space being occupied. It is no coincidence that the modern museum is built up from spaces that have much in common with the square that faces the church or the seat of the government, the Grand Boulevards that always face the enemy. Especially modernity, as it still dominates the city of today, needs to be impressive in that sense. How we are disciplined according to the object. The fascisms of forms occupy the common. Michel Serres claims that there are three kinds of quasi-objects, as he calls them, and that have been very good in stopping time. And Michel Serres also claims that the only thing in which human society is different from any kind of animal or non-organic society is that human society invented objects. We invented objects, and we invented objects to keep the balance. We invented objects to keep the hierarchy intact. So Serres comes with three examples, and he says this is at work in all societies. All societies invent religious objects. All societies invent objects of war, weapons. And all societies invent capitalist objects, money. And why do they do that? Always to keep the society intact that it is. Which means keep the poor poor, keep the wealthy rich, keep the priest in power, keep the statesman in power, keep the people with money in power. So it's according to these three types of objects that all societies are organized. It's a very interesting idea. And that's what the object is all about. The object is invented in order to stop the time, is what Michel Serres says. To stop the time means in order to prevent any form of revolution. Religious objects are invented to prevent any kind of revolution. Society should stay as it is. The same goes for weapons. Weapons are not made to be used. Atomic weapon is the best example for it. They're not made to be used. They're just like religious objects. They're put in the middle, and we have to do a dance around them. Same thing for money. We, the 99%, don't have money, but we circle around money. Our life functions according to it. And the same goes for atomic weapons or any kind of weapon, or any kind of religious totem. So objects are invented by us, by all of us, in order to keep society intact. And it happens often to artworks. Artworks can be turned into objects, that I was just talking about. Artworks can be turned into objects. They are no objects at all. They're the opposite of us. Why would I say that art is the opposite of object? Because what happens with art is, I should do this without a text. What happens with art is that what art does is, instead of the powers that be, instead of the hierarchies of society, instead of what we can call the present being these three kinds of objects, the religious, the war and capitalist objects, and the way they structure society, so that would form the present. Art is doing something very differently. Art is trying to destabilize the present. So instead of functioning with the present, instead of functioning with the structures of society, instead of keeping these structures intact, which is exactly what money does, what weapons do, and what religious objects do, art does not function with the present. That's why I like the term the contemporary. I would say art is something which is about the contemporary. Etymologically speaking, what happens with the times. So in that sense, there is no history of art at all. There's even not a present of art. Art is about an intervention in the present. And this intervention can last forever. And that is why good artworks will always somehow destabilize things. Because they do not function with the present, as they do not function with history, as they do not function with the future. There's a different sense of time with art. And why is this? Because art, in the end, does not function with the object. The object is, in the end, art gone bad. Art being captured by either religion, war, or capitalism. And those are exactly the three forces that threat art. In earlier times, religion was the strongest force in which art objects could be kind of captured, placed under a badge. Of course, war was a very powerful force in objectifying art. As the statues on squares still prove us. As so much music still proves us. And the last kind of object being capitalism, being money, is of course today a very powerful way of objectifying art. So these three forces are a major threat to art. And what good art does, and what good art keeps doing, is to traverse these kinds of objects, to traverse the present. And I think that is exactly what new materialist artists, like in the exhibition you can see here, try to do. New materialist artists do not function within the history of art. They do not function within a present, in the sense that they are not interested in creating objects that are easily captured by Belgians. But what they try to do is that they search for the unforeseen entanglement. And the unforeseen entanglement that somehow disrupts the present, that disrupts our ideas about how things work in the world, that disrupts the way in which the three kinds of objects organize our thinking. The three kinds of objects, again, religion, war, capitalism. Those have been very powerful in structuring our thoughts. And what art does, and why art objects, is because it is always in search for ways of traversing. I use the word traverse, which I take from Felix Guattari. Traversing these particular structures. Also traversing the oppositions, the way we started, right? The oppositions or the dualisms that are so familiar to us. Matter and mind, nature and culture, male and female. And you can see that in various artworks in this exhibition, these kinds of oppositions are also questions. So the idea of nature and culture is definitely being questioned in a series of artworks. Fabricated and non-fabricated. What is the difference? We create that difference. Male and female. Strange opposition. Why do we use it? Why do we keep installing this opposition? Those are the questions that are being asked in the kind of art that is somehow linked with the materialism ethics. And I think it's of crucial importance, especially in our times, in which these dualisms, these various forms of objects are in a way stronger than ever. Religious objects, the objects of war and the objects of capitalism, are being critiqued, especially since 1968, but still, or perhaps they've gone through a revival. If you look at the world in 2018, I would definitely say that they are extremely powerful in structuring society, in creating the 1%, in finding a kind of status quo that prevents any form of revolution. So in that sense, and that is also the quote that you started with, in that sense I think that what the world needs now is art, and art of the strongest kind. And it would be the kind of art that challenges these hierarchies, that challenges the object, that challenges any kind of structure that in some way prevents revolution from happening. It's almost at my time.
It can be.
Yeah.
You can open it up to.
Yeah, I would like to.
Yeah. Thank you, Rick. That was really, really important to hear, actually, and really very thought-provoking. And I think it's important for many of the artists and those interested in the arts to think about whether we're making it, looking at it, or thinking with it. So thank you for that. I think it also introduces some questions we can think about as to how we can both defend the arts and the humanities today against this process of what you have called objectification according to these particular structures which keep the status quo intact. And I guess if I can exploit my position, my first question, which we can then open up to the audience, is so processes of objectifying, as you call it, a work of art, they are processes. So a work of art is made and then perhaps it enters into the market, or it's used for, or it is organized according to the structure of religion, money, or war. So if objectification, as you described it, is a process, then how does one negotiate that process? And presumably an artwork also goes in and out of being in the bell jar and and being out of it. And can you think of the ways in which perhaps artists, because I think all artists here will have this experience of also just needing to, these sort of practical experiences of having to live and having to sell an artwork or to work with structures of power which are associated with domination and oppression. But how can these two kind of realms of revolution, intervention and ossification kind of be negotiated by an artist? I'm basically asking for practical advice.
Practical advice is always good. I'm not against capitalism, and I'm not against any kind of societal structure in that sense. And I think that you used some interesting words, negotiation process. Is important. I think for artists it is very important to remain playful in that sense, and sometimes you're not in control anymore, especially once it's finished or once it's sold, then kind of what do you do with it? But the playfulness is very important, I think, and the playfulness means that somehow in the artwork there should be a kind of force which is not willing to submit to these forces, which is probably a definition of what good art is. So I guess we're all in search for that. It's not really an answer, or really kind of this is what you should do, but I think the playfulness is very important. So I'm not what I want to stress is I'm not against capitalism. I don't think that we all should make art that is from an anti-perspective or anything. But it's important to keep in mind how this process of objectification works, and in order to remain playful, to kind of negotiate in how you position yourself as an art group and how you want to position your art in the art world, whether you want it to remain or not, for instance. But I think that a lot of artists in how they are much more engaged with environments these days, and much more in search for other forms of performance or other forms of installation, or much more engaged with negotiating with the present. I think it's quite a strong movement in the arts that links very well to these new materialist ideas. So, and it's not necessarily a conscious kind of, you don't have to read anything from Deleuze before you can turn into a new materialist artist or something like that. It's kind of a position of negotiating with the present that is often already quite interesting.
Have any questions?
Yes, I have a question. So you mentioned that we are all, it's from the perspective of an art block, yes? So we are all programmed by these three forces, right? The religion, the weapons, and the capital. But it seems that when a person goes into the museum, he interprets the artwork, right? So if we are programmed by these three structures, does that mean that our interpretation is out of the question because we are not going beyond those three things?
It's a good question. Thank you very much. It's as a visitor or as someone who is kind of exposed to an artwork. there's also a negotiation process going on in your mind, of course, and in your body, and how you relate to the artwork. I think all of us, I mean, modernism was such a strong force, and all of these the structures of society, so these three forms of objects have been so powerful in constructing our minds, in even considering ourselves opposite to the artwork, for instance. That's also something that many artists are playing with nowadays, of course, not being exposed to a particular artwork, but mingling in, being a part of it. It's a very interesting thought, of course. Yeah, I think that it is important to put things at stake in that sense. And I guess that, and this is what authors like Reza Negarestani, he writes a lot about that. If you want to be if you are interested in otherness, it is not so much that you open the door to the other, as Jacques Derrida would say it. He says you should allow the door to be opened by otherness. So it would be you should, as a visitor or as someone exposed to art, you should allow yourself to be overwhelmed in that sense, which is quite a difficult thought process, of course. But as long as you are able to understand how powerful these forces are, how powerful these processes of objectification have been for you. I mean, I'm talking about religion, war, and capitalism. I mean, these are three very abstract terms, of course. But we can all understand how far-reaching the power of capital goes. I mean, it's not something which stops with the idea of money. It is something, and the whole society spins around it. But the same goes for warfare, of course. The whole idea of a society, the fact that you are one country and the country next to you is another country, it's quite a bizarre idea which we have internalized and we work with it, and the whole of our lives we cannot escape this kind of objectification. And the same goes for religion, of course. And religion does not only mean God, it means any kind of idolization which happens everywhere all the time. So it's quite a far-reaching force, and it really creates societies, these three forms of objectification.
Mm-hmm. And if we understand that we are programmed with these three objectives, can we find another meaning in artwork? And should it be that way that people should understand these three things, those three powers?
Well, I think that if you understand more of how societies function, and then in the end, yes, you should read the works of Deleuze and Guattari, and you should read Marx, and you should read Freud, and to understand, and you should also read Kant, of course. But the more you kind of are able to map how societies work and how power work functions, and how this is at work in every everyday situation, then of course you are much more able to question your own thoughts. I mean, a lot of in many different ways we are all very stupid, and we have no clue what's going on in the world, and we just respond to our habits, and we are not allowing ourselves to be opened up in the outside world. It's only very recently that we started thinking about something like the extinction of the human being. It was unthinkable 10 years ago, and now because of the ecological disasters, and because all of a sudden the world shows that, hey, something very different can happen. You also have a very warm summer here, right? It gets scary after 30 days without rain. I don't know if you have that too, but in the Netherlands we haven't had rain in 30 days, which is something which has never happened. So all of a sudden there's another force at work, and this is something which definitely kicks in and which makes you question very, very basic things in life. Yeah.
Could you expand or talk about where authenticity of our work of art lies in that new materialism paradigm?
Yeah.
Is it, and the relationship, how that authenticity changes as a work of art is being made into an object or objectified or not?
That's a very nice one. Yes, authenticity is often misused concept, of course. It is very often linked to identity, or there's often linked to an idea of fixedness. I would say it has absolutely nothing to do with identity. It has absolutely nothing to do with fixedness. I would say that any kind of authenticity has to do with a force, with a kind of force, with an ability to traverse through something. So a good artwork in that sense is still, as I put it earlier, able to break through the objectifications of life, or able to break through the structures of society. And in that sense, it finds its authenticity in its objection to anything. So in that sense, to come up with a very cheesy example, I do think that, for instance, the Guernica of Picasso, it can be turned into an object when it's printed on your cups and all that, which happens, unfortunately. But still there is this kind of resistance in it that is stronger than any book on war. If you look at the Guernica itself, this is how terrible things can turn out. So it's very powerful. That kind of power, I think, is very important when you talk about the authenticity of an artwork. And the kind of power doesn't always have to do with this kind of a political painting. It can also be in a Vermeer painting, or in a Vilnius or any kind of art that in some way has this force in it which is able to question other things, whatever these other things in the present are. So it has nothing to do with the identity of the artwork, with the object that it is. It has nothing to do with the kind of stable idea of what a good artwork is all about. It has to do with a kind of force, I would say, kind of power, which is why it also kind of persists.
You have a witness, like a kind of manifestation of the will of an artist, which is able not to deal with the common rules or the comfort zone. I mean, I use, for example, materials sometimes in order to feel the viewer present, and not to pimp my artwork, if I can say it that way. But I have the feeling that it's anyway like a vicious circle, so a dialogue which is over, or which is in return, in loop. And sometimes I feel like a victim of the problem that creativity has its own limits. And I I can only relate to the studio praxis and which once again, so I go over talking about materials and actions. Just sometimes I really enjoy the talk, but yeah, maybe it's already like the solution comes to the fact that more questions are moved. But could you imagine, for example, that this kind of research could find a stream connected to the new technology and the society development, or something that really take the distance from, or
it's not that. So this is not psychoanalysis. So I don't have solutions for how to live a good life as an artist.
Yeah, sure.
But the things that you're struggling with are genuine, of course. I mean, this is what any practice in that sense is about. And I recognize the circling and the vicious circling. Search for a way to break out. I mean, as a writer of philosophy text, you have the same thing. My workspace is probably a lot smaller than your studio even, so you can turn pretty crazy. And in a sense, that is also what is so problematic about this kind of life, in a sense, is that it's in a way, and this is what Rosie always says, in a way it's inhuman also to write a book. It's inhuman, it's too much work, you are completely stuck up in your own world and for such a long period of time. But it's the only way to deal with things. It is the only way to search for something else. And in that sense, personally, I couldn't think of anything else to do. But also, I think that I recognize this search not only with what you were saying, but also with how other artists and how other philosophers are struggling with the present, as I just call it.